Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Red or Blue Pill, the False Choice in Double-Bind Relationships. Let me tell you why you are here. You have come because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You've felt it your whole life, felt that something is wrong with the world. You don't know what, but it's there like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? The Matrix is everywhere. It's all around us, here, even in this room. You can see it out of your window or on your television. You feel it when you go to work or go to church or pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo, like everyone else. You were born into bondage, kept inside a prison that you cannot smell, taste, or touch. A prison for your mind. Hi everybody, and I'm taking my life in my hands by using the example of The Matrix, the film that's incredibly popular, and I understand it's gone through various iterations and franchises, they say, but the original 1999, I think it was, has been really influential, especially with this notion of the red versus blue pill. So the blue pill, if you take that, you can just go back to sleep and docility and not have to deal with reality. If you take the red pill, it's like the Wizard of Oz. You get to see behind the curtain as to how things really work. Now, I'm not criticising it, before all the keyboard warriors come after me, I'm not criticising it as a film, although I do find it slightly droll that Keanu Reeves, the most wooden an unemotional actor potentially in the history of acting, was chosen to be in a cyberspatial type film. But anyway, let's leave that one to one side. Let's just say it's a great film. I'm not going to comment on its movie status, but what I would say is that I think it's got its underlying philosophical message that seems very popular is quite flawed, if you ask me, and I'll go into detail as to why. And what I'm going to propose in this video is a different concept, not the red or blue pill, which I think is a false choice, but the notion of the double bind, which I'm going to explain using lots of practical examples and some technical information. So it's a psychiatric, psychological notion pioneered by a guy called Gregory Bateson, who I've covered in a previous video briefly. The one with the jackdaws on the front, the playful art of signals, I think I called it. But he had this notion that he developed over a weird pathway that he took, starting with research amongst tribes in New Guinea that had only just recently stopped being cannibals. So he observed them, did some anthropology, moved on to zoology and cybernetics, and all the time was building this notion of the double bind, which is the quickest possible definition is you have two choices and you have to choose something, but neither of them are good options. As opposed to why I'm suggesting, and I'll explain why I think that's more psychologically realistic than this idea that if you just take a pill, you get to see what lies beneath the surface. So without more ado, let's get stuck in. So the basic choice being given to Neo, as we'll soon see, I'll look at the specific exchange, but it's docility versus revelation. So take the blue pill, go back to sleep, or just go back into a docile existence. Take the red pill, you actively get to see what lies behind everything. Now this is what I think is the false dichotomy. So I'm calling it a false choice, and I think, and I'll be careful what I say here, I don't want to offend any of our larger sized viewers, of which I can hardly cast the first stone. But this idea, I'm going to call it mental Ozempic, because it's the mental equivalent, the intellectual equivalent of this huge shortcut. So in my case, for example, let's not personalize it onto anyone else. If I want to lose weight, I'm hardly svelte. I would stop drinking industrial amounts of Nigerian Guinness and perhaps cut down on the pies that I enjoy. I'm not going to take a pill as a shortcut for the hard yards, both literal and metaphorical, that I should be undertaking. And I just think it's so ironic that this idea that the red pill, blue pill, the red pill phrase is very popular still, despite the fact it was originally, 1999 film. And I hope that's right, because that's from memory, but it must be 1999 or thereabouts. But the idea that, you've been red pilled, that's common usage now to suggest that you've seen the truth of any given situation. You're not suffering from ideological delusion. And that just strikes me. I understand it's a film. I understand it's just a metaphor. And I wouldn't be picking on the film The Matrix, except people have run with this idea. And insofar as they're influenced by philosophical ideas, it just saddens me that quite a shallow idea like this has gained such purchase. So if I'm going to make that claim, I have to back it up by suggesting the notion of the double bind is a much richer, more complicated, but also more rewarding idea. So I've set out my stall. Let's see if I can convince you. So one aspect of the double bind, which I'm going to give you a practical example of very quickly, but just yet more context just to annoy and frustrate you. The double bind, unlike the red pill, the double bind concept is about how we are trapped in certain communicational loops when we're in relationships, whether it's societal or, as the research on double bind, Gregory Bateson's idea first started, he was looking at family dynamics and how people could be led to schizophrenic behavior by the family dynamics they found themselves in. And I would suggest it started off with family dynamics, but Bateson himself increasingly recognized that you could actually apply this notion on a broader scale, which I'm going to argue. But the point about it is, and we'll talk later on about how you can perhaps transcend, might be the right word, but basically this paradox is part of the human condition. Communication is difficult. When we're in relationships, we get into loops that go round and oscillate. And to the extent that we can escape these loops, it's often at the cost of great creative energy and effort. And that is quite different from this idea, just take a red pill, just take a Ozempic, and you can either see the truth or lose a shed load of weight. This easy shortcut. And there's various points in Bateson's work where he actually explicitly criticizes the notion of shortcuts, which is interesting. And I'll reference later on with reference to a palm tree, just to be enigmatic. But anyway, without whittering on, here's one of the it's one of the most cited short examples of the concept of the double bind. But I just beware, I'm giving you the example, but it's complicated. But the whole point of the double bind is that it's a relationship, it's an ongoing concept that you can illustrate with specific examples, but those specific examples are slices of time, and they don't actually fully convey the ongoing nature of the double bind. But, like I say, without whittering on, here we go. So this is from Bateson's own work. A young man who had fairly well recovered from an acute schizophrenic episode was visited in the hospital by his mother. He was glad to see her and impulsively put his arm around her shoulders, whereupon she stiffened. He withdrew his arm, and she said, "Don't you love me any more?" He then blushed, and she said, "Dear, you must not be so easily embarrassed and afraid of your feelings." So this gives you a flavour of the double bind. This young patient who's been driven to schizophrenic symptoms, you can see, and it reminds, sorry, it's not funny, but I think there's a gallows humour joke among psychiatrists when they talk about schizophrenic patients, and I've heard them or read, they've made the comment, if you think the patient's bad, you should see the family members, meaning the people in the family who are supposed to be sane. And the implication is it's the behaviour of the so-called sane members of the family that have driven the schizophrenic patient to the hospital where they are. But anyway, I think you can see in this example the damned if you do, damned if you don't aspect, which is only one aspect of the double bind. Whatever this patient does from an ongoing relationship with his mother, one of the aspects is this has gone on for a long time because this is the nature of their relationship. And he can't win because she will turn the tables on him no matter what he does. So that's one aspect. And there's this brilliant article I'm quoting from here. It's from a collection where various people discussed Bateson's idea of the double bind. And maybe on another occasion I'll look at this specific paper in a lot of detail, because irrespective of the topic about the notion of the double bind, what this Gina Abelez does is she talks about the difficulty of researching a concept through experiments trying to prove it's true or false, when the concept itself doesn't lend itself to scientific experimentation, basic causality. Because the whole point about the double bind is it's not about someone does X and then you do Y. It's this the double bind is more paradoxical and ongoing. It's not static. The idea of the matrix is that you take the red pill and you then see what's behind the curtain. You see what is going on. That can't happen in the double bind because actual human relationships and modes of communication are such that these are ongoing relationships. You can't just take a snapshot and suddenly see the truth. And that might sound like quite a specific or pedantic distinction, but it's crucial. And what Gina Abelez does in her paper is just, like I say, irrespective of the fact it's about the double bind, she shows the limitations of the scientific method when what you're trying to prove or disprove is, for want of a better word, more artistic. It's like, trying to do a scientific experiment on a Shakespeare play. The Shakespeare play contains lots of psychological and philosophical truth. But how would you ever try and ascertain that from causal experimentation in a laboratory? It just doesn't work. And people have tried to engage with the concept of the double bind using causal experiments of proof or refutation. And her article is just brilliant. It just points out that this is a fool's errand. But anyway, this is her very short definition. Double bind theory is about relationships and what happens when important basic relationships are chronically subjected to invalidation through paradoxical interaction. So that's a psychological, psychiatric way of describing the previous example of the mother and son. So it's a relationship between mother and son. It's an important basic relationship. And that relationship is chronically subjected, in other words, this has gone on time after time, to invalidation through paradoxical interaction. So the mother constantly undermines the son. And one aspect of all this is that the language is often used in terms of there's a victim and there's a perpetrator. But that's unfair in a sense. It is possible in the family dynamic that people aren't fully conscious of what's going on. And hence they have to go to therapy, or they have to get, in extreme cases, psychiatric care. So one aspect of the double bind is not all or even none of the parties involved may know what's going on consciously, so they can't necessarily control their own behavior, because they're all interacting in this recursive loop, often with negative feedback, and it's difficult to disentangle themselves. They can't see the wood for the trees, so to speak. So this idea of not being able to see the wood for the trees, what the outsider can't see. So to back up the point I've just made, I think most of you, or I'm just deluded, but I think most of you will have encountered instances whereby you've been visiting another family and you've seen an argument where you can tell that someone's become very upset, but it seems that their reaction is quite disproportionate. And you feel like, sometimes I've done it, I've intervened and said, oh, why are you being so hard on that person? And in various ways, the response can often be, well, you don't know the context, or you don't know the history of this, or you don't know how many times this has happened before. And that's one very commonsensical and basic illustration of this idea that the double bind refers to things that go back in the dynamic, in the recursive loop, that don't lend themselves to just easy observation. This can be deep psychological stuff. And what I haven't mentioned so far that might be worth mentioning is I can see how a lot of this notion of the double bind can be related to things like narcissistic personality disorder and narcissistic abuse in relationships, which may or may not be conscious, but sometimes the person behaving so atrociously and dragging you into their fantasy world and manipulating you and being inconsistent so you don't know where you stand at all. I think part of the whole double bind recursive loop, the whole family dynamic, or if it's just two people in a relationship, this process actually, I can see lots of links, which hopefully over time I'll develop more. But anyway, just to back up this idea of what the outsider can't see. Such things are difficult to illustrate. Double binds are so embedded in the relationships of which they are a part that they are hard to see. In any relationship with a history, the factors are so many and so varied that an observer is likely not to know what many essential reference of a given statement may be, even if explicit verbalizations were the main means of communication. So I think what this suggests is that, let's just say you're observing, as I mentioned, a family get together and there's this sudden bad feeling, or there's an argument. And what Abelez is, based upon Bateson's work, is pointing out is you can't do a content analysis of the specific things that are said. Because what if, for example, a relatively innocuous comment is made with a particular tone of voice that an outside observer may not pick up on, or may not be as sensitive to, or may think the person who's feeling very sensitive has imagined the tone of voice, because you have different experiences of the people closest to you, what their tone of voice is, what their bodily gestures are, that may be completely missed by an external observer, or someone even close to the family but isn't a family member. So again, it's a commonsensical observation, but there's, that no one can annoy you, in my experience, as much as family members. And likewise, if I really, really want to annoy someone, I find it most easy with family members, because you know all their nuances, you know all their subtleties, their peccadillos, their idiosyncrasies. And let's think of it a different way. You must have experienced whereby you can be very critical of a family member, and let's say there's a friend alongside you, and if they join in and criticize your family member and say exactly what you've said, you can then feel, hey, it's not your place to comment, and you can turn against that person because you suddenly feel defensive about your family member. So family dynamics have these emotional investments in them that are incredibly difficult for others to relate to. And that is a major component of the double bind. So it's beyond, and the key point here is that nuance and that subtlety is beyond explicit verbalization. So you have to have a broader notion of what the idea of communication is. It's not just words in sentences. It's the whole context of a family dynamic. Or I keep saying family dynamic, but this refers to any type of relationship, arguably. So this is why I think that it does have relevance to things like narcissistic personality disorder in, let's say, just a couple of people in a romantic relationship. And to re-emphasize this notion of relationship, I'll try and include in the comments, sorry, in the description section. I think you may be able to access it. It may be behind a paywall, but hopefully you will. But it's a British newspaper called the Daily Telegraph. And there's an article where a woman is talking about 3 past relationships, long-term relationships. So I think the first one was she's had a son with a man, and then they've split up. And then over quite a long period of time, she's had 2 further relationships. And her suggestion in the article, she has a slight rider at the start, a little caveat that basically says, I understand I'm the common denominator in this process, so it could all be me. But then she very quickly moves on and develops this notion of miserable man syndrome, or appeals to it, and claims that all 3 men are basically at fault because they all exhibited the same tendencies eventually, even though for a long time the relationships were good. Now, I don't mean to personalize it against this woman, and if you can access the article, it will be interesting to get your views in the comments. And like I say, I will put it in the description. Hopefully you will access it. But what I think this woman's missing, and I just picked the example because it's from a few days ago, it's very topical. This woman seems to be oblivious to the idea that, and you can switch the genders completely if it was a man complaining about 3 women. She misses the idea that a relationship is an ongoing dynamic structure. And the idea that you can find a fault within the other person is sometimes, obviously, if they're extreme, then, it's a really abusive relationship. Well, there's an obvious fault in the other person, but she's not claiming these men are abusive. She's claiming they've just got miserable man syndrome. They eventually become more and more detached and isolated and cold and indifferent. And my response would be, well, maybe what they're all doing that is the same, even though they're different men, is because the dynamic that you've set up with these men over time has led to these symptoms. This isn't inside the men. This is a manifestation of the health of the relationship between the 2 of you. And to try and claim that it's faults inside them, I would suggest is profoundly missing the point. But as I'm saying all this, I am very conscious of the fact that if I put myself forward as some type of relationship guru, anyone who takes relationship advice off me, off someone who looks like me and sounds like me, needs to reevaluate their life choices, if you ask me. But so I'm offering this just as an illustration of the double bind. So let's say I'm channeling Gregory Bateson or Gina Abelez, and it's not my personal view, but I think they would say about this woman complaining about these 3 men that she's missed the whole point of the dynamic structure of a relationship. And in future, I'm going to talk about alcoholism and addiction through Gregory Bateson's ideas. And in a similar way, he argues it's a mistake to look inside the addict for there to be a simple, solvable weakness. His argument is that it's the relationship of the addict to the society around them and their choice of an addiction to deal with the problem they have relating to that society. So it's much more context-driven. It's an ecosystem type issue rather than any faulty lever within the machine of that person. And I just think that's quite an interesting perspective. Like I say, with addictions a common problem, so I think a future video on that might be vaguely interesting. So, though every communication says something about the relationship of the communicants, examples which can illustrate the invalidation of a relationship with a few exchanges of remarks and gestures are difficult to find. So this is a Belez still. One speaks of binds in referring to isolated incidents which exemplify the pattern. However, the concept can be better appreciated in its proper, more encompassing application. The relationship is a bind. Isolated examples of double binding communication illustrate the relationship, characterized as it is by chronic threat of invalidation. So this is just reiterating what I've basically said. The relationship, the context within which you're relating to somebody else, and the flowing of information and gestures and word-based sentences, but also visual gestures, tone of voice, all these things create this loop. And that's what becomes, in Morpheus's phrase, the prison of the mind. And an extra dynamic is it's characterized as it is by the chronic threat of invalidation. So this refers especially to the weaker person in a relationship. So, for example, a child and a parent. In the child's mind, there's a constant threat of invalidation, both the way in which the parent views them as a child, which obviously has a disproportionate value. When you're a child, there's nothing you want more than validation from your parent. And also you have a morbid fear that your parents won't be there for you. And as you know, none of us truly grow up, especially in my experience, but the idea that when you're in a relationship, there's still, if you're in a manipulative relationship with a raging narcissist, this constant threat they might have of invalidating the relationship, as the mother did with the son. But this can also happen in peer-to-peer romantic relationships. So to relate this back to the concept of the film The Matrix, this is when I really need, well, apart from anything else, I've been talking about narcissism, so I could do with my good friend Richard Grannon to tell me why everything I've said so far is rubbish. But also, he does an absolutely brilliant impression of this guy Slavoj Žižek, who's a Slovenian philosopher I've done a lot of work on in the past. And he's one of the few, well, I was going to say not amongst philosophers, but he's even scruffier than I am. So I've got a soft spot for Slavoj. But he did this film documentary called The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, Lacanian Psychoanalysis and Film. And if you can find it on some type of service provider, cable, pay-per-view or whatever, it's well worth a look, because this very funny, and he's got a very heavy lisp and a very Eastern European accent, but he puts himself on the actual sets of various famous films and provides film analysis. And he does this on the actual original set of The Matrix, or they patch him in so it looks like he's on the original set. So he's in the armchair facing Morpheus, having a conversation about the two pills, the red or the blue pill. So this is from Zizek. The choice between the blue and red pill is not really a choice between illusion and reality. Of course, the Matrix is a machine for fictions, but these are fictions which already structure our reality. If you take away from our reality the symbolic fictions that regulate it, you lose reality itself. And this is where I do my bad impression. I want a third pill, which is how he sounds, believe it or not. A pill which will enable me not to see the reality behind the illusion, but the reality in illusion itself. If something gets too traumatic, too violent, even too filled in with enjoyment, it shatters the coordinates of our reality. We have to fictionalize it. So I agree and disagree with the statement that Zizek makes. I disagree to the extent it goes back to my point about mental Ozempic. I don't want a third pill. As this channel constantly argues, I want art and I want literature to be a resource through which people can engage with the paradoxes of life that are unavoidable. But art and literature help you at least deal with them, but they don't propose that you will escape them, which the red pill suggests, that take this pill and you will escape the problem, that the false reality you're in. I do agree with the way Zizek's emphasizing that reality as we understand it as humans has an innately fictional element. We have to structure it in symbolic and fictional ways to make sense of it. So maybe I'm being a bit pedantic, but I just think he's played to the gallery when he says, I want a third pill. No, you don't, Slavoj. You want to use the art and literature that he's already an incredibly erudite, educated man. So he doesn't need the third pill at all, and neither do you, and I don't either. I'm getting myself wound up now. But anyway, to develop this point further, what I find interesting is, whilst the Matrix, the character Morpheus, is suggesting there's a red pill, and he's suggesting that this is what we can do to see the truth, he himself, Morpheus, uses the language of a great literary work like Alice in Wonderland. So this is this is illustrations from 1908, I think, as she falls down the rabbit hole, which, if you read the original, is lined with books and shelves with teacups and stuff, but interestingly, books. And just to reiterate, Morpheus, the character Morpheus, uses Alice in Wonderland to make his point. So I would suggest, if you think I'm advocating endlessly till I'm driving you to distraction the power of art and literature, it's interesting, even in a film that's claiming that it has the solution in the form of a red pill, they have to express themselves using the literature that I'm claiming is the ultimate resource. And this is one of the elements I was just emphasizing. It's also interesting that the character is called Morpheus, which is the Greek god of dreams and sleep. So even in the film, the characters are relying upon the resources of mythology, Greek mythology, and literature in the form of Alice in Wonderland to make their points. And that, I just find that slightly ironic, and hopefully that will be taken on board by all the keyboard warriors who get incredibly defensive about science fiction and how philosophically important the Matrix is, and why are you advocating literature when it's obviously nonsense and we should all be watching the Matrix instead. So this is from the Matrix. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. So Morpheus, the name of the character taken from the Greek god for sleep and dreams, is, in order to express this idea of going deep into reality, relies upon a beautifully evocative image from a children's literary classic. And this isn't from Alice in Wonderland. This is from Alice Through the Looking Glass. And this is the bread and butterfly. So it's basically made of bread and butter, and you can just about see it. Its head is made of a sugar cube, which you'll find is vaguely amusing. So it's chapter 3. Crawling at your feet, said the gnat. Alice drew her feet back in some alarm. You may observe a bread and butter fly. Its wings are thin slices of bread and butter. Its body is a crust, and its head is a lump of sugar. And what does it live on? Weak tea with cream in it. A new difficulty came into Alice's head. Supposing it couldn't find any, she suggested. Then it would die, of course. But that must happen very often, Alice remarked thoughtfully. It always happens, said the gnat. And I love this for various reasons. One, it's just a bizarre idea of the bread and butterfly. But two, the idea that this is kids' literature. And let's just park for one side the oddness of Charles Dodgson, Lewis Carroll, and his relationship with small kids, which the scholars have argued about how deviant or non-deviant he was for decades now. But I just love the fact that this is children's literature that has just very dark elements to it. So there's gallows humor. The idea is that this bread and butterfly is likely to die because it can't find this incredibly specific food stuff, and B, even if it does, because its head's made of sugar, the very food stuff it relies upon to survive is the food stuff that's going to kill it. So there's just a lovely paradox there. And this is the Hollywood version, the Disney version. And notice how just nauseatingly saccharine the whole thing is. But also, there's no concept of the death-dealing head of a sugar cube. This is the movie equivalent of decaffeinated coffee, which, as you well know, decaffeinated coffee is an abomination. It is the work of Beelzebub, the beverage of Beelzebub. It completely defeats the purpose of drinking a coffee, and I won't let anyone try and convince me otherwise. But anyway, I get myself wound up again. But just, I hope you can see just how saccharine that is compared to the other, much less technologically sophisticated pen and ink illustration. But this is so much more lacking both in substance and execution, if you ask me. So then I'll give you a definition of this idea of the formal double bind. Bateson refers back to this bread and butterfly in Alice Through the Looking Glass. And he uses an example of evolution that is over-specialized. So the idea that I know the bread and butterfly is a figment of Lewis Carroll's imagination, but Lewis Carroll and people of the time were fascinated by Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species and the whole concept of evolution. And in some ways, the bread and butterfly is a parody of the theory of evolution, because the bread and butterfly is over-specialized in its food source so much that it gets in this death loop of the very food that it needs to seek out is the food that will kill it. But if you use that as a metaphor or an analogy for how we learn, I'll develop in a second this idea that you can go down evolutionary cul-de-sacs, you can go down evolutionary dead ends, but part of the creative learning process is not to over-specialize like the bread and butterfly. It's to go through the process and realize you've hit a dead end and then find an imaginative way out of the predicament. So this is in from a workshop on the Bateson participated in. The bread and butterfly finds himself in the situation that if he gets his food, his head dissolves in it. Therefore, which is my sense of humour, I'm sorry. Therefore, his only hope for survival is not to find any food, but then he starves. But this, you see, is a formal double bind of the simplest kind. It is the case where the two adaptations overlap to make contradictory demands. This will always happen when you get over-specialization of various kinds. I suspect that the actual dilemma of the bread and butterfly is probably a very important part of the whole evolutionary process. So I'll just throw that in there. I want to do a future video as I develop. I'm going to bore you to death with Bateson videos. But there's an element about learning, deutero learning he calls it, where it's about, it sounds complicated, it's learning about the act of learning. And this is relevant to that, but I just wanted to show you, again, how even in children's literature, there's a very intuitive sense of various double-bind aspects that are quite deep, even in a story for kids. And this is what we've lost in contemporary society, because we've decaffeinated everything so much that we're left with the Disneyfication of everything. But just to get deeper and deeper into the notion of what the double bind is, I'm now going to give you some visual examples of what the double bind isn't. So it's not just a mixed message. And having spent 7 wonderful years, see if you can pick up on the subtlety of the sarcasm in my voice. I had 7 years of Scottish hospitality. This just amuses me, the idea that the Scottish Tourist Board is asking people to keep out. I actually don't think this is a mixed message. I think it's a fact. They probably spend good money doing market research on this. But anyway. And then I live in North Wales, but this is a sign, and this is from the Gale of Glamorgan. So it's South Wales, and the Llantwit in Major, that's the anglicised version. The actual Welsh language version is Llanilch Tudvar, or apologies to any Welsh speakers. I think that's approximately how it's pronounced. But as you can see, unless there is a perfectly circular road deviating from the right and the left of this sign that meets in a perfect loop, I'm struggling to see how this road sign makes any sense. So that's a very confusing choice you have in front of you. And then you've got Catch-22, which again isn't... It's got similarities to the double bind, but it isn't. And if any of you haven't read Catch-22, please do. It's brilliant. They're bomber pilots in the war. And so Catch-22 has obviously entered the English language, but it's full of brilliant characters. So my favourite is a guy called Dunbar. And I mentioned at a talk I gave in Liverpool, the beauty of Dunbar is he has this theory where he wants to live a very long time, but he can't be bothered putting the effort in. So I relate to this. So his solution is to make his life feel as boring as possible, on the basis that the more bored you are, the slower time passes. So he reckons if he could live to just a half-decent age, it will be the equivalent of somebody else who's lived a manic, interesting life, be the equivalent of living to 150 or something. So I don't know why I find this so appealing. But the idea, so on that basis, I'll probably live to 130. But he takes all interest out of his life in order to make it seem longer. But that's not the main aspect of Catch-22, but it's a beautiful novel about, if any of you dislike bureaucracy as much as I do, Joseph Heller portrays the American army as this incredible bureaucracy where nothing makes sense. And this is the Catch-22 fallacy that you get involved in. So soldiers, specifically pilots actually, want exemption from deadly attack on the grounds of mental health. So the question the army would ask you, or the Air Force, are you willing to enter into this deadly mission? Yes. So it goes off to the right. Will you go into the deadly mission? No. Well, if you say no, you don't want to go on the deadly mission, you're acting rationally, so you haven't got any mental health problems, so you have to go on the deadly mission. So that's the Catch-22. Whatever you do, you're going on the deadly mission. And there's elements of that in the double bind, but as I'll keep explaining, it's more complicated than that. But the frustration of going around in circles, I do think the Catch-22 novel is a brilliant portrayal of at least one small element of this concept of the prison of the mind, as Morpheus would call it. And then to give you another example how art can present some of these aspects, not the whole thing, but aspects of the double bind. Remember the earlier quotation from Abelez where she's talking about you can provide individual examples, but that's not quite the same as providing the whole phenomenon. But this is a Banksy mural, I believe, from London. And I hope you can make out it's Princess Diana in the guise of Mary Poppins. So and there's sort of social commentary involved, so that she's got a Harrods bag but I'm showing you this as background. I'm going to give you an excerpt from the actual story of Mary Poppins. And again, if you get to see, or you get a copy of the original Mary Poppins, the illustrations are absolutely stunning. But in this case, Mary Poppins, the governess of Jane and Michael, the two small kids, visits Mrs. Corrie's sweet shop. Mary and the children meet Mrs. Corrie and her two daughters, Annie and Fanny, and this is one of the scenes. So I think P.L. Travers was Australian, but anyway. I suppose, my dear, this is Mrs. Corrie, she turned to Mary Poppins, whom she appeared to know very well. I suppose you've all come for some gingerbread. That's right, Mrs. Corrie, said Mary Poppins politely. Good. Have Fanny and Annie given you any? She looked at Jane and Michael as she said this. Jane shook her head. Two hushed voices came from behind the counter. No, Mother, said Miss Fanny meekly. We were just going to, Mother, began Miss Annie in a frightened whisper. At that, Mrs. Corrie drew herself up to her full height and regarded her gigantic daughters furiously. Then she said in a soft, fierce, terrifying voice, Just going to? Oh, indeed. That is very interesting. And who, may I ask, Annie, gave you permission to give away my gingerbread? Nobody, Mother, and I didn't give it away. I only thought. You only thought? That's very kind of you, but I will thank you not to think. I can do all the thinking that is necessary here, said Mrs. Corrie in her soft, terrible voice. And then she burst into a harsh cackle of laughter. Look at her, just look at her, cowardy custard, crybaby, she shrieked, pointing her knotty finger at her daughter. Jane and Michael turned and saw a large tear coursing down Miss Annie's huge, sad face, but they did not like to say anything, for in spite of her tininess, Mrs. Corrie made them feel rather small and frightened. And again, I just find it brilliant that in a kid's story, there's such dark psychological insight. And it really is. Mrs. Corrie's a fascinating character because I think she can break off barley sweets. Her fingers, she can break them off and they're sweets, and her fingers grow back. And she's very small, and her daughters are these big galoots. They're these massive children that she has, grown adult children. And the whole thing, the bizarreness, the psychological cruelty, but this is one instance of the double bind in a family dynamic. The contradictory. In this case, obviously, Mrs. Corrie's, enjoying her manipulative behaviour. But in other cases, it's not always true that there's such conscious manipulation. But again, I would have thought that if you know about narcissistic abuse in relationships, you would see some parallels with this. And this goes to my point about the importance of literature. Because kids aren't reading this type of stuff anymore. This is brilliant preparation, if you ask me, for how basically demented and cruel adults can be. If you've read this as a kid, I just think it prepares you for a life of the double bind. So I've given you an awful lot of context, and now I didn't want to just define in its most technical psychiatric sense what the double bind was, because it's just A, it's very dry, and B, unless you've got the context, because it's all about the context of recursive loops, the definition on its own probably wouldn't have made much sense. So I hope I've done it in the right order. But this is more, and it's actually, again, I just love that Abelez's article, because this isn't I will in future videos go specifically to Bateson's definition, but this is Abelez's summary of Bateson's definition, if that makes sense. And this is much more succinct actually than Bateson himself. So whoever this Gina Abelez was, I've no idea. Apart from the name, I don't know anything about her background. But this paper she wrote is stunningly beautifully written, not in a literary sense, but just the economy and efficiency with which she expresses her ideas that about very complex ideas. I just think it's absolutely brilliant. So well done, Gina. I'm sure my commendation means a lot to her. So the double bind may be described briefly as an interaction pattern characterized by severe limitations imposed by paradoxical communication in an intensely important relationship, which results in an untenable situation, but one from which its participants are unable to extricate themselves. Quotation, the quotation marks in other words, denote phrases most typically associated with the concept. Certainly in these terms, the description is ambiguous. A more explicit kind of definition can be drawn up by listing the elements which comprise a double bind. So before I go on to that, she's giving an overview definition. And I hope you can see that those characteristics were all present in the Mary Poppins example. So there's a severe limitation that characterised the interaction pattern. The two large daughters are trapped in this sweet shop. So they're spinsters basically with their mother. And we can argue about, well, they should have moved out. But if they've been in a dysfunctional relationship since early childhood, that's easier said than done. It's an intensely important relationship, ditto, it's their mother. It's an untenable situation. That's why the big galoot of a girl cries, because whatever she does, her mother's going to upset her. And as I said, they're unable to extricate themselves because of the weird emotional blackmailing type dynamic going on. So that's the overview, and then here are the specific elements. So an intensely important relationship, parent-child being prototypic, in which there occurs a communication involving a contradiction in levels of meaning, which requires a response which, in order to be adequate, includes responding to the basic contradiction. Such a response is difficult to achieve because of the denial or concealment of the contradiction which is contained in the message itself. It asserts something. It asserts something about the assertion itself, which is, however, incongruent with the primary assertion, and the incongruence is implicitly denied. So that D is just a very complicated way, although accurate, describing the paradox that when you're trying to respond to an irrational demand without pointing out it's irrational, then you're just caught in this recursive loop. Furthermore, there is a prohibition against leaving the field. In other words, the person must respond within this context, even though there is no adequate response. And the individual cannot, or at least does not, explicitly comment on his predicament, i.e. he does not meta-communicate. So that was the point I was making. You're not in a situation, for example, as a small child, to comment upon the ridiculousness of your parent acting like a manipulative child, for example. That's not really open to you, although theoretically it is. In practical family dynamics, that's not how it works. This kind of situation is habitual in the relationship and comes to be expected. So it's almost like a form of brainwashing because it happens repeatedly. So I know it's you go from A to G, but the way in which they're interwoven, I hope that conveys a sense of how complex the recursive loop is of communication that will be verbal, gestural, emotional through tone of voice. All these things all come together. And insofar as there is a matrix, to go back to the film reference, this is the matrix, these interwoven loop-like modes of communication. It's not something that you're ever going to understand by taking a red pill. Sorry, Morpheus, you drug pusher. So this all points to the limits of reality and communication. So this idea, a major element of the film is this difference in reality and its representation. So the map is not the territory, the word is not the thing it describes. Whenever the map is confused with the territory, a semantic disturbance is set up in the organism. The disturbance continues until the limitation of the map is recognized. Excuse me. So a major element of the film is this difference between reality and its representation. The fact that Neo, the character, was asleep in this fake world, and it's only when he takes the red pill that he goes down the rabbit hole that he sees the reality behind the representation. But I'm just pointing out that this notion was referenced as early as 1933. And Bateson cites Korzybski, this book, Science and Sanity. And I believe, I'm not familiar with Korzybski's work. I think I've ordered this book. But he's been quite a major influence on self-help gurus and various people. And like I say, Bateson was aware of his work. But what I want to focus on here is when it says, if you get confused between the map and the territory, it sets up a semantic disturbance. So again, in future videos, because it's such a potentially big topic, I'm going to address the concept of language and the double bind. And because I've always argued literacy is so important, and because we're losing literacy, young people don't read as much, young people aren't as articulate, so they confuse, or they don't confuse, but if you notice, this is a real bugbear of mine. Young people and adults as well, for that matter, will constantly say literally when all they mean is something happened. They don't seem comfortable with the distinction between the metaphorical occurrence and a literal occurrence. So they keep saying literally when they don't have to say it at all. And also, it's quite funny that young people specifically always seem to say like every third word. So everything's an analogy or a simile. And partly it's me being a pedant. But also, I honestly think there's an element of this, that the relationship of the map and the territory for young people is very confused. And one of the symptoms of this confusion is an inability to use language properly, or as Korzybski's talking about, semantic disturbance. But more specifically, this is how Bateson uses this idea. Sorry, I'm really thirsty today. He talks about, I love this phrase. I'll try and say it in a vaguely threatening way. Deviant syllogistic structure, which relates to this idea. I just love deviant syllogistic structure is a very complicated way of saying people lose the ability to use language properly, but also the reasoning that normally is implied in the commonsensical use of language. So just to illustrate, this is Bateson talking. In place of structures which derive from the syllogism, and a syllogism, I should have explained, for those not familiar with philosophical terminology, a syllogism is just a mode of thinking typified by the logical causality of something like, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. It's a deduction that you can work out from the relationship between the component parts. So that's all the syllogism is. So he says, in place of structures which derive from the syllogism, Barbara the schizophrenic uses structures which identify predicates. And I've added over-identify predicates, as you'll see. So predicates being relating to the subject, the quality of a subject. Men die. Grass dies. Men are grass. Do you see how the relation between the subject and the object in these clauses are misconstrued? So because men and grass have the same action, Barbara, this particular schizophrenic, makes the false link between men and grass. And it might sound bizarre and odd, but these are based upon Bateson's studies with schizophrenic patients. What they tend to do, and this is another, when I look at metaphor, but I want to look at, he actually shows how, in order to defend themselves from the situation they're in, schizophrenic patients will fall back on literal expressions that are inappropriate in that particular context, or conversely, metaphorical expressions that are inappropriate. And because they're inappropriate, and because they don't make complete sense, that provides the schizophrenic patients with some distance from the situation. So it's like a linguistic symbolic defense mechanism. So this is relating to Barbara, but she must live in this is where Bateson talks about schizophrenics in general, but I'm relating it with the S back to Barbara. So she or he must live in a universe where the sequences of events are such that his unconventional communicational habits will be in some sense appropriate, which is another way of, I clumsily expressed, what seems to us unconventional, mistaken use of language. This is the defense mechanism of the schizophrenic person. They're reacting like this to avoid greater psychological harm by confronting the double bind they found themselves in. So the family dynamic is so bad, this is symptomatic of their response. But just to go back, if you keep that fresh in your mind, so I've just shown you the semantic disturbance set up in the organism. So that's the semantic. But now I want to show you not just the semantic, but the visual and the way in which the excessive conceptualization of the world through spatial means. So if you think back to the bread and butterfly, it was going to become extinct because it had evolved into such a specialized creature that it was no longer tenable as an animal. And when there's this mismatch, as said here, between the map and the territory, there's the notion of the semantic disturbance, which affects the organism. And I'm now going to show you not just the semantic, but the spatial and the conceptual. So these are images I've shown in previous videos, but just to return to them, this is the Renaissance, the rediscovery of lineal perspectival drawing. So you can see how objectifying and quantifying this way of seeing the world is, and how long it's been present, this bias towards this way of seeing in Western society. So that's how you begin to see things when lineal perspective is dominant. You know, the world becomes quite a mechanical, spatially orientated place to be. And remember, think back to the idea of a semantic disturbance. This is the visual equivalent. When that gets taken to the nth degree, like the bread and butterfly takes its evolutionary process too far, this is what we end up with. And why this matters, I can hear you shouting at me. Why does it matter, Paul? Well, a palm tree has no cambium, and cambium is a substance that helps the trunk thicken. Is it cellulose? It's some type of biological material. A palm tree has no cambium surrounding the trunk, no way of depositing additional layers of wood and becoming thicker as it grows taller. A palm tree just grows at the top and eventually it falls over. Continuous first-order growth is fatal. So, does the pain of growth come out of the need for second-order change? And is addiction somehow the reciprocal or opposite of growth? So what I'm suggesting is, via Bateson, that when you grow only in one direction, in other words, we use visual perspective, we use a scientific quantification of the world around us that leads to social media, cyberspace, the matrix. This in nature is the equivalent. When there are no breaks, there isn't, ironically, enough paradox to keep us held back. And when you find yourself in a double bind, I'll start to sum up now, but when you find yourself in a double bind, what occurs is this self-perpetuating oscillation. And I've used the idea of the Ouroboros in the past, this mythical snake eating its own tail. So a true double bind is not simply an awkward situation in which we are damned if we do and damned if we don't. For this usually amounts to no more than the lesser of two evils. Nor is a double bind equivalent to the horns of a dilemma, where one is presented with the choice of conflicting alternatives, both of which are similarly unfavourable. A true double bind, or a situation set up or perceived as one, requires a choice between two states which are equally valued and so equally insufficient that a self-perpetuating oscillation is engendered by any act of choice between them. So what happens is you just flip from one option to the other. Neither of them is helpful or validating. And that causes great psychological disturbance. So a true double bind does not therefore imply a bankruptcy of choice itself. The oscillation involved is not the result of a dilemma in which one cannot or would rather not choose between alternatives, between the devil and the deep blue sea, for example. It is the result of the fact that one must choose, and moreover choose between incompatible alternatives. It has to be emphasized that the necessity of choosing is not a property of the double bind per se, but of the context in which it is used. So it's this forced element of the choice, which I think is an underestimated aspect of the whole matrix red pill, blue pill idea. The only way you can see the truth in that model is to take the red pill. So once you're committed to finding out the truth, you're basically forced to take the red pill. What's different about the double bind is that you oscillate. There isn't this scenario, as I've mentioned before, where you take the red pill and you suddenly see the truth. In the double bind, there's this constant oscillation between unsatisfactory poles. So I'm beginning to now wrap up, but also, because all this will be dealt with in future videos in different contexts. But, what are the possible ways out of this? So, outside the context of the socially defined imperatives plastered up all around us, a traffic sign saying, disregard this sign, does not have any necessary signification. And even without that context, the laughter the example usually evokes neutralizes any oscillation by meta-communicating about the double bind involved in it. So all jokes are in any case dependent on the confusion of logical types evident in disregard this sign. So what that's suggesting is, and I'll show you the actual... I've forgotten where this was in America, but this was, someone put this up, and I think it was quickly taken down. But that's just a practical example. And what I'm suggesting in this instance is, it happens to be humour here, because when you saw that sign, if you think through its paradox, you realise that it's not an appropriate road sign. And you may find that funny, but that gives you a context in which you can transcend the eternal loop of pay attention to a road sign, no, ignore the road sign. So that double bind fails because you can see it for the joke that it is. And in this case, laughter helps you see that meta-communication. What the child can't do, the child can't drag themselves out of their situation. Humour, art, literature, these things can. They help you. Transcend is the best word I can think of. You don't escape the paradox, but you learn to see it for what it is, a paradox that sometimes can be safely ignored. So I do think that's quite a... So that's an obvious practical, although it's got a humorous artistic element to it. This would be a more specifically artistic example of that. I think my memory is so bad, but I think the original title for this was The Treachery of Images, at least in English. And it was in 1929. Apologies if I've got that wrong. I should make notes at some point, shouldn't I? But I keep convincing myself I have a good memory and I don't. But I hope you can see the link between that work of art and the road sign. They're both asking you to think, I hate using the phrase, but outside the box. And when you're caught in a double bind, you're within a box that you can't break out of. And then what are the consequences of this? So again, I'll be pursuing this all in future, but just to wrap up the ideas. This all, when you're stuck in the double bind and you don't have art or you don't have a sense of humour, there's an inability to let off steam. So this again is Bateson. If an individual doesn't know what sort of message a message is, he may defend himself in ways which have been described as paranoid, hebephrenic, which refers to delusions or hallucinations, or catatonic. These three alternatives are not the only ones. The point is that he cannot choose the one alternative which would help him to discover what people mean. He cannot, without considerable help, discuss the messages of others. Without being able to do that, the human being is like any self-correcting system which has lost its governor. It spirals into the never-ending, but always systematic distortions. So two things here. I'm going to show you what the governor is. It's a escape valve in mechanics. But also key in that phrase or that excerpt is, he cannot without considerable help discuss the messages of others. Again, this is what art and literature does. It allows you, it's the considerable help that allows you to reflect upon the fundamental nature of the messages of others. It's not the red pill, it's not an easy solution. It's confronting paradox head on, like the Magritte painting, this is not a pipe. Like the road sign, disregard this sign, ignore this sign. You have to find this ability to meta-communicate, to step above normal communication and reflect upon the frame of reference. So this is that thing referred to as the governor, and I'm suggesting we lack this. So the idea is on the left-hand side, when the steam power gets too great, I'm assuming this is how it works, those balls rotate until they start raising and they lift the valve. So the steam escapes the system and it powers back down to a more safe range. And that's an actual, for those that you don't like schemas, schematic diagrams, this is the real thing. And then I am really finishing. I keep saying I'm going to finish, but I promise you I am. Talking about letting off steam, please just indulge me with this one. If you remember, I did a video on the myth of Sisyphus, the anxiety, which I call the anxiety of absurdity. It was all about Albert Camus. And I hope he doesn't take it down now, but this was one of the comments by a guy called Jimmy Cunningham. And I just find it hilarious because this is an example of the previously mentioned semantic disturbance. And also, I do think what the matrix of the social media does is not allow steam to escape. So people get hot under the collar, so to speak. So this was the wonderful comment he left after that video I toiled over to present Camus' great insights to you. And this is what my mate Jimmy came up with. A birdism, so I think he's misspelled that, is just a weak, I'm assuming the next thing says ass, cope. If you have time for art and contemplation, you are one privileged MF. I believe capital letters imply shouting. So you are one privileged MF. This is F rubbish. So I do have a sick sense of humour, but thank you, Jimmy. I really genuinely enjoyed this because I think it illustrates a lot of the points I've been trying to make about the importance of literacy and artistic infused reason and all the things Jimmy seems to struggle with. So apologies from one privileged MF. And to finish, I wanted to show you just two more images. Which, talking about not being able to let off steam, I love this picture. I did a short video on it at the very beginning of the channel. But I love the way this is. It encapsulates the tension of a middle-class family. They're all looking in different directions. The little girl's looking accusingly at the viewer. The father seems isolated. The mother seems very protective. The little girl in the middle looks quite mischievous. The way she's presenting herself, she only has one leg. I'm assuming the other one's tucked up. I just think it's the beginning of Anna Karenina, isn't it? All happy families are happy in the same way. All unhappy families are happy in their unique, different way, or words to that effect. So this has been quite a long one, and I'll just finish with if there are any. I guess there's some film nerds who are getting quite angry because I kept claiming that the red pill was from the film The Matrix, which obviously it was, but this is Total Recall, which again is 1990, and if any actor could rival Keanu Reeves for being wooden and stilted, I think old Arnie could. But this was a scene in Total Recall, which I think predates the Matrix use of the notion of the red pill and being able to see the truth behind reality. So there was an awful lot there. It was a long one. Apologies for that. But I think it's appropriate at this time to finish with the immortal words, I'll be back.